In November 2001, our members were continuing the painful but necessary task of searching Ground Zero for the remains of our fallen brothers and the thousands of innocent citizens that were killed, because precious few of those who died in the terrorist attacks had been recovered at that point. Prior to November 2001, 101 bodies or remains of firefighters had been recovered, and those on the horrible pile at Ground Zero believed they had just found a spot in the rubble where they would find countless more that could be given proper burial. Nevertheless, Giuliani, with the full support of the Fire Commissioner Thomas von Essen, decided on November 2nd, 2001, to sharply reduce the number of those who could search for remains at any one time. There had been as many as 300 firefighters at a time involved in search and recovery, but Giuliani cut that number to no more than 25 who could be there at once. Here is where the mainstream falls short in their reporting. Why would Giuliani all of a sudden forcefully remove firefighters from the pile, and in such a way that resulted in a brawl between the NYPD and NYFD? What the mainstream press will never dig into or question is, why did Giuliani place more importance on cleaning up the pile than in taking a slow retrieval approach to accessing the bodies of firefighters, police, and emergency workers still trapped in the wreckage of those buildings? Though 2 months later, chances were that no one was still alive, many still clung to the hope that loved ones would be dug out of the devastation of those destroyed buildings. Families wanted a chance for closure, bodies of their loved ones returned so that they could honor them with a proper memorial and burial. The firefighters believed that the city went to a scoop and dump policy because they were in a rush to retrieve gold. The fact is that the mayor's switch to a scoop and dump coincided with the final removal of tens of millions of dollars of gold, silver, and other assets of the Bank of Nova Scotia that were buried beneath what was once the towers. Once the money was out, Giuliani sided with the developers that opposed the lengthy recovery effort and ordered the scoop and dump operation so they could proceed with redevelopment. With his training as district attorney for New York, Giuliani knows from his prosecutor days that the first rule of a criminal investigation is in cordoning off a crime scene and preventing the tampering or removal of any piece of evidence within that area. Usually officers are put in place to prevent the eradication, removal of, or disruption of anything within that scene. Surely the events of September 11, 2001 constitute the most egregious, barbaric, terroristic, and criminal act ever perpetuated on American soil. End quote. Now, as that article details in some length, the issues of Giuliani and the crime scene of Ground Zero in the weeks and months following 9/11 involve not only the criminal act of tampering with the evidence of that crime scene, which included, as we've detailed in previous episodes of the Corbett Report podcast, preventing even volunteer teams of researchers from studying the remains of those towers to try to come to a better understanding of how they collapsed, instead making the sole purpose of the entire operation on Ground Zero that of dismantling the pile and getting rid of the evidence as quickly as possible. And here we have another missing clue as to why this may have happened. And according to the firefighters, at any rate, it's because of the tens of millions and, according to some reports, billions of dollars of gold which were hidden underneath the World Trade Center and which had to be removed as quickly as possible. Now, there are unsubstantiated theories on the internet that the billions of dollars that were hidden in the various vaults under the World Trade Center complex may have been tampered with on the day of 9/11 as the attacks were taking place, that in fact 9/11 may have had elements of a gigantic bank heist. Now again, I can't vouch for the validity of these reports, but I do think they're interesting and worth looking into as another possible clue on the 9/11 money trail. But one very real and very important 9/11 money trail clue came out not on 9/11, but on 9/10. On that day, Donald Rumsfeld made a cold and calculating announcement that, in fact, the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion. Again, that's $2.3 trillion with a T, which represented about the same amount of money for the entire federal budget of the same year. How $2.3 trillion could go missing from the Pentagon has never been accurately explained. To get more details of this story, Let's listen to the following news report.
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, the world changed. And in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten.
My '03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. To understand how the Pentagon can lose track of trillions, consider the case of one military accountant who tried to find out what happened to a mere $300 million.
We know it's gone, but we don't know what they spent it on.
Jim Minery, a former Marine turned whistleblower, is risking his job by speaking out for the first time about the millions he noticed were missing from one defense agency's balance sheets. Minery tried to follow the money trail, even crisscrossing the country looking for records.
The director looked at me and he says, "Why do you care about this stuff?" It took me aback, you know. My supervisor asked me why I care about doing a good job. So
he was reassigned and says officials then covered up the problem by just writing it off.
they got to cover it up. That's where the corruption comes in. They've got to cover up the fact that they can't do the job.
The Pentagon's Inspector General partially substantiated several of Minery's allegations, but could not prove officials tried to manipulate the financial statements. 20 years ago, Pentagon employee Franklin C. Spinney made headlines exposing what he calls the accounting games. He's still there, and although he does not speak for the Pentagon, he believes the problem has gotten worse.
Those numbers are pie in the sky. The books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
Retired Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan commanded the Navy's Second Fleet the first time Donald Rumsfeld served as Defense Secretary.
With good financial oversight, we could find $48 billion in loose change in that building without having to hit the taxpayer.
In the 2.5 minutes since this report began, the Pentagon has spent nearly $2 million, and it may never know where 25% of those tax dollars went. In Los Angeles, I'm Vince Gonzalez for Eye on America.
Now, despite the incredible nature of that admission, $2.3 trillion simply missing from the Pentagon, announced casually the day before 9/11. It was never followed up on in the controlled corporate media, who had other agendas to cover after, of course, the events of that day. One brief bright ray of hope occurred in 2005 when Representative Cynthia McKinney grilled Donald Rumsfeld during the House hearings on the 2006 budget for the U.S. Department of Defense. Let's listen to McKinney as she questions Rumsfeld on the missing trillions and hear Rumsfeld's pathetic response.
I thank the gentleman, the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McKinney.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I watched President Bush deliver a moving speech at the United Nations in September 2003, in which he mentioned the crisis of the sex trade. The President called for the punishment of those involved in this horrible business. But at the very moment of that speech, DynCorp was exposed for having been involved in the buying and selling of young women and children. While all of this was going on, DynCorp kept the Pentagon contract to administer the smallpox and anthrax vaccines and is now working on a plague vaccine through the Joint Vaccine Acquisition Program. Mr. Secretary, is it policy of the U.S. government to reward companies that traffic in women and little girls? That's my first question. My second question, Mr. Secretary, according to the Comptroller General of the United States, there are serious financial management problems at the Pentagon, to which Mr. Cooper alluded. Fiscal year 1999